Before we begin, I need you to imagine something. Imagine you are 9 years old. You are standing in the rain with your best friend. You are both soaked to the skin. You have no umbrella. You have no money. You have nothing except each other and a dream so large it feels almost embarrassing to say out loud. Now imagine that 30 years later, that dream, the one you whispered in the rain to another child who had nothing, has come true. Not for one of you, for both of you. That is not a movie. That is not a fairy tale. That is the story of two real boys who made a promise to each other when they were young enough to still believe that promises could survive everything life throws at them. Most promises don't survive. We all know this. Time erodes them. Distance dissolves them. Disappointment, jealousy, success, failure. Any of these things can take a promise made in childhood and reduce it to a memory you are slightly embarrassed to recall. But some promises are different. Some promises become the spine of a life. Stay with me, because what happened between these two boys, what they built, what they almost lost, and what one of them almost did to destroy everything, is a story I have been waiting a long time to tell. And it starts, as the best stories always do, on an ordinary day that nobody thought to prepare for. The year was 1989. The place was a small city in the south of England called Exeter, the kind of place where the streets were old and narrow, and the weather was always doing something dramatic, where history pressed in from every corner, and the people who grew up there either left as fast as they could or stayed and put down roots so deep nothing could move them. Daniel Reeves was 9 years old. He was a small boy, thin in the way of children who eat well enough but move constantly, always running somewhere, always thinking 3 steps ahead of wherever their feet happened to be. He had his father's wide forehead and his mother's quick eyes, and he had a habit of asking questions that made adults uncomfortable, not out of rudeness, but out of a genuine, insatiable need to understand how things worked. He wanted to understand everything. Why some families on his street had 2 cars and others had none. Why the man who ran the corner shop worked 16 hours a day and still worried about money. Why some children arrived at school in September with everything new and others arrived hoping nobody would notice what they were wearing. His mother always gave him the same answer. Because of where they started, Daniel. But where you start is not where you have to finish. He wrote that down in a school exercise book he kept under his mattress. The day his life changed was a Thursday in October. It had been raining since noon, the kind of persistent, gray, determined English rain that settles in as if it has nowhere better to be. Daniel had been sent to the corner shop by his mother and was sheltering under the awning of a closed hardware store, watching the rain and waiting for it to ease, when a boy sat down next to him. The boy was taller than Daniel by half a head, with the kind of face that suggested he had seen more of the world already. Not older, exactly, but steadied in the particular way of children who have been responsible for things children should not yet be responsible for. He was carrying a plastic bag with groceries in it and a wet library book pressed against his chest, as if protecting it from the rain mattered more than protecting himself. "Which school?" Daniel asked, because that was how you establish coordinates with a stranger your age. "St. Matthew's. You?" "Westfield Primary." "What's your name?" "James. James Carter." "Daniel Reeves." They shook hands with the slightly comic formality of boys who have been told that a handshake is a serious matter. And then, because the rain showed no sign of stopping and they had nothing else to do, they began to talk. They talked for 2 hours. The rain lasted 3. By the time the sky cleared and children started jumping in puddles and the street returned to its ordinary self, Daniel Reeves and James Carter had told each other more truth than either of them had told anyone in years. James's father had left when James was 7. He was the oldest of 3. His mother worked 2 jobs, a morning shift at a bakery and an evening shift at a supermarket, and James made breakfast for his younger siblings before school every single day without being asked. He was 12 years old, and he was already, in every practical sense, the man of the house. But James had a dream. He had had it for as long as he could remember, and he had never told anyone because the people around him would either laugh or feel sad, and he wanted neither reaction. He wanted to be a civil engineer. He wanted to build things, bridges, roads, structures that connected places that had been separated, that made movement possible where movement had not existed before. He had seen a documentary about the construction of the Millau Viaduct in France, the tallest bridge in the world, and something in his 12-year-old chest had caught fire and never gone out. Daniel listened to all of this without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When James finished, Daniel was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that surprised even himself. "I want to start a company. I don't know what kind yet, but I want to build something that employs 1,000 people, so that 1,000 families don't have to worry the way my family worries sometimes." James looked at him for a long moment. 1,000 people is a lot. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "Then let's make a promise," James said. And there was something in his voice that was not childish at all, something steady and deliberate, the voice of someone who had learned early that words, properly meant, could be load-bearing. "Whatever happens, whether we lose touch, whether life takes us different places, whether things get hard, we find a way to help each other get there. You to your 1,000 employees, me to my first bridge. We don't let each other give up, even if we have to drag each other." Daniel looked at this boy he had known for 2 hours, this boy who was carrying a wet library book like it was something precious, this boy who was 12 years old and already carrying a family on his back, and still had a dream large enough to fill a room. He extended his hand. "Promise," Daniel said. "Promise," James said. They shook hands in the rain-cleaned air of an October afternoon, two boys with enormous dreams and empty pockets, and absolutely no reason to believe that any of it would work out the way they hoped. And then they went home to their separate lives. Nobody saw it happen. Nobody recorded it. There was no camera, no witness, no adult who looked at two boys saying goodbye under a hardware store awning and recognized that something significant had just occurred. But it had. The years that followed were the years that test promises. Daniel and James stayed in contact the way children did before mobile phones, through letters, through messages carried by mutual friends, through the occasional visit when school holidays aligned. The letters they exchanged were not sentimental. They were practical, almost businesslike. Progress reports, setbacks, plans revised in light of new realities. Reading them back years later, Daniel would remark that they read less like letters between friends and more like dispatches between partners, because that is what they had become, partners, each one the other's most honest observer, the person to whom failure could be reported without shame and success could be celebrated without jealousy. James struggled. His secondary school was underfunded and overcrowded. His mathematics teacher changed 3 times in 2 years. He taught himself advanced calculus from a textbook borrowed from the public library, sitting at the kitchen table after his siblings were in bed, the house quiet, the street outside going dark. He sat for his examinations and passed everything, including mathematics, with the highest marks in his school. He applied to study civil engineering at the University of Bristol. Everyone around him said it was too ambitious. The university's offer arrived on a Tuesday morning while his mother was at work. James read it standing at the kitchen counter, and then sat down very slowly on the floor and stayed there for a while. Not crying exactly, just holding the reality of it before anyone else could make it smaller with their surprise. He wrote Daniel a 1-line letter that afternoon. "I got in. Bristol. Engineering. The promise is still alive." J. Daniel wrote back the same evening. "So is mine. Economics at Warwick. We're going to be fine. D." University changed both of them, but not always in the ways they had hoped. Daniel arrived at Warwick and discovered within the first semester that he had a gift he had not known about, not just for understanding economic theory, but for understanding people, for reading a room, for knowing what someone needed before they asked. His professors noticed. His classmates noticed. By his second year, he was the person everyone came to when they needed something organized, something negotiated, something made to happen. He began running small ventures, a printing service for final year dissertations, a group purchasing cooperative that saved students money on textbooks. Nothing dramatic, but each one taught him something. Each one added a layer of understanding about how things worked. James, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle entirely. The engineering program at Bristol was rigorous and demanding. James navigated it with a patience that unsettled some of his classmates. He simply kept going. When a module was poorly taught, he found better resources. When a professor moved through material too quickly, he stayed after to ask questions nobody else thought to ask. When other students spent their weekends recovering, James spent Saturday mornings at the university library, working 2 weeks ahead of the syllabus. But in his third year, something happened that the promise had not prepared either of them for. James's mother had a serious accident, a fall at work, the early morning bakery shift, a wet floor, a moment that lasted less than a second, but whose consequences stretched into months. She was unable to work. She was unable to pay rent. She was unable to do anything except recover, slowly, in a flat that was 3 months behind on payments. James wrote Daniel a letter. Not a desperate letter. James was not built for desperation. A factual letter. The situation, the costs, the options as he could see them. He was considering leaving university, getting a job, any job, and returning to his studies when things stabilized. Daniel received that letter on a Friday evening. He read it once, folded it, put it in his pocket, and did not sleep that night. By Saturday morning, he had made some calls. By Sunday evening, he had arranged something. By Monday, he had sent James a reply. Do not leave. I am handling something. Give me 2 weeks. The promise is still alive. What Daniel had done, what he had arranged in those 2 days, was something that would define the nature of their friendship forever. And it was something that, years later, James would describe as the moment he understood what it truly meant to have a brother. But to understand what Daniel did and why it mattered as much as it did, you need to understand what Daniel had to sacrifice to do it. And that is where this part of the story must pause. Daniel had the money, but it wasn't his to give. And the person it belonged to was someone he could not afford to lose. Daniel Reeves and James Carter made a promise to each other at 9 and 12 years old, standing under a hardware store awning while the October rain came down. James wanted to build bridges. Daniel wanted to build a company that employed 1,000 people. They promised to drag each other to their dreams if they had to. When we left them, James's mother had been seriously injured. The cost of their situation was threatening to pull James out of university, out of the engineering program he had fought to enter, out of the future he had been building one early Saturday morning at a time. And Daniel had said 4 words that carried the weight of everything. The promise is still alive. Now it was time to prove it. The money Daniel had access to was not his own. Over his first 2 years at Warwick, Daniel had been quietly managing a small savings group among 15 students from his department. Every week, each member contributed a fixed amount. Every month, the full pooled sum rotated to one member. It was an old system, a trusted system, built entirely on honor and mutual accountability. Daniel was the coordinator, the keeper of the records, the person everyone trusted to manage the rotation fairly. And at the moment James's letter arrived, the pooled sum sitting in the group account was scheduled to go to another member, a girl named Sarah, who had been waiting for her turn for 11 months and was planning to use the money to cover her final semester rent. Daniel sat with this for the entire sleepless Saturday night. He could not take the money. It was not his. It belonged to 15 people who had trusted him specifically because they knew he would not treat it as his own. Taking it, even temporarily, even with every intention of replacing it, would be a betrayal of that trust. It would potentially destroy Sarah's semester. It could collapse the entire group, which some of these students depended on as their only financial lifeline. He could not take it. But James was going to leave university. James, who had taught himself calculus from a library book. James, who had carried a wet textbook through a rainstorm because protecting the knowledge inside it mattered more than staying dry. James, who had already paid more dues than most people pay in a lifetime. Daniel did not take the money. Instead, he called a meeting. On Sunday morning, he gathered all 15 members of the savings group in a common room and told them everything. James's situation, his mother's accident, the rent arrears, the risk of James leaving university. He did not ask them to give their money away. He asked them to vote on whether to make a group loan, to redirect Sarah's turn to James as an emergency measure, with Sarah's agreement, on the condition that Daniel personally guaranteed repayment within 6 months. He then looked at Sarah directly. I know this is your money. I know you have been waiting. If you say no, the answer is no, and we move on. I will find another way. But I am asking. Sarah was quiet for a long time. She was a practical woman, pragmatic in the way of people who have learned that sentiment is a luxury and decisions must be made on evidence. She asked one question. Is this person worth it? He is the most worth it person I know, Daniel said. And there was something in the way he said it, something without performance or persuasion, just plain truth, that settled the room. Sarah agreed. The group voted, 14 in favor, 1 abstention. The money reached James within the week. His mother's rent was paid. The immediate crisis passed. James stayed in university. Daniel paid back the savings group loan within 5 months, faster than he had promised. He did it through a combination of the dissertation printing service he had been running, 3 weeks of paid tutoring, and one significant decision he never told anyone about. He declined a competitive overseas exchange scholarship he had been awarded, a semester in Singapore that would have looked extraordinary on any graduate application, because accepting it would have taken him away from Warwick during the repayment period. He told the scholarship office it was personal reasons. He told no one else. He did not tell James. He did not tell James because the promise was not transactional. He was not keeping score. He was not accumulating debt on James's side of a ledger. He was simply doing what the promise required, and then putting it away and moving forward. James graduated with a first-class degree in civil engineering. He was one of only 3 students in his cohort to achieve it. His final year dissertation, a structural analysis of low-cost pedestrian bridge design for underserved rural communities, was cited by 2 of his professors as work of genuine, publishable quality. He got a job at a civil engineering consultancy in London 2 months after graduation. It was not a glamorous position. It was exactly the kind of role where you learn everything by doing everything, where you are the most junior person in every room, where the gap between your dreams and your current reality is wide enough to be demoralizing if you allow it to be. James did not allow it. He spent 4 years at that consultancy. He worked on drainage systems, road resurfacing projects, and a small footbridge across a river in rural Wales that he later said was the most satisfying thing he had ever built. Not because it was impressive, but because on the day it opened, elderly residents who had been walking a 2-mile detour for years crossed it in under a minute for the first time. He called Daniel from the bridge on the day it opened. I am standing on a bridge I built, Daniel. I am standing on it right now. How does it feel? Like the promise? Daniel understood exactly what he meant. Daniel, meanwhile, had built something of his own. After graduation, he spent 3 years working for a logistics company in London, learning, observing, storing everything. Then at 27, he left and started his own supply chain company with 1 van, 2 employees, and a client list consisting entirely of people who trusted him personally. Within 2 years, it was 12 vans and 35 employees. Within 5 years, it was over 180. He was careful about growth in the way of someone who has been close enough to financial difficulty to understand that recklessness with other people's livelihoods is a form of cruelty. He never expanded faster than he could sustain. He never promised what he could not deliver. And he never forgot that every employee number was a family attached to it. At 31, he had 312 employees. At 34, he passed 500. He was on his way to 1,000. And then the call came, not from James, from James's business partner, a man named Marcus, at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. "Daniel, I think you need to come to London. There is a problem with James, a serious problem." Daniel was in Manchester. He was on a train by 6 the next morning. What he found when he arrived was something that no amount of preparation, no amount of friendship, no amount of shared history could have made him ready for. James had made a decision, a significant, potentially catastrophic decision, and he had made it alone, without telling Daniel, without asking for counsel, without using any of the judgment that had carried him from a borrowed library book to a first-class degree to a bridge that elderly residents crossed in dry shoes. The decision involved a government infrastructure contract, a large one, and a man who had made James an offer that was dressed in the language of opportunity, but was, underneath the polished presentation and the handshake and the glossy proposal, something else entirely. Something that could end everything: the company, the career, the freedom. And James had said yes. The contract was already signed, and the man on the other side of it was not someone you could simply walk away from. Daniel had 48 hours to find a way out, or watch his best friend lose everything they had both spent 30 years building. There is a question that sits at the center of every long friendship, not whether you will celebrate each other's victories. That part is easy. The real question is whether you can survive each other's worst mistakes, whether you can stand in the rubble of something the other person broke, look at them clearly, and still choose to stay. That is the question Daniel Reeves walked into London to answer, and the answer he found, after 48 of the most difficult hours of his adult life, is the reason this story is worth telling. The man's name was Richard Holt. He was a property and infrastructure developer who had spent 20 years accumulating government contracts through a combination of genuine competence and a method of doing business that operated carefully in the space between what was legal and what was not. He was not provably dishonest. He was connected. He was generous with the right people at the right moments, and he had a particular appetite for attaching his company to rising talent. Engineers, architects, project managers, who brought credibility and skill while he brought access. James had been on his radar for 2 years. The offer had come in the form of a joint venture, Holt's access to a major government road rehabilitation contract, combined with James's engineering firm's technical credibility. The contract value was large enough to transform James's company from a respected mid-sized firm into a major player. The paperwork appeared legitimate. The revenue projections were real. What James had either missed or chosen not to examine too closely was the nature of Holt's influence over the contract, the official who had steered it his way, and what that official expected in return. Not money necessarily, loyalty. The kind of loyalty that, once given, becomes a leash. James had signed because he was tired. That was the truth he told Daniel on the night Daniel arrived, sitting across from him in his office at midnight, the London skyline visible through the window behind him. "I am tired, Daniel. I have been building the right way for 15 years, slowly, carefully, honestly. And every year I watch people who build the wrong way go further, faster, higher. I watched 3 firms get that contract before it came to me, and every one of them was less qualified than my junior engineers. I am tired of doing everything correctly and still having to prove myself to people who have done nothing correctly." Daniel listened without interrupting. He had learned, over 30 years of friendship, that James needed to speak before he could think clearly. That the words had to come out in their rough, unprocessed form before clarity arrived. When James finished, Daniel was quiet for a long time. How long did it take you to sign? 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks, how many times did you think about calling me? James looked at the table. Every day. Why didn't you? James was quiet for a long time, and then he said the most honest thing he had said all evening. Because I knew what you would say, and I wanted to do it anyway. The room held that sentence for a moment. Outside, London continued in its indifferent way, distant traffic, the city that never fully stops. Daniel nodded slowly, not in agreement, in recognition, in the understanding of someone who has known another person long enough to know the difference between a mistake made in ignorance and a mistake made with full awareness. Okay, he said. Okay? That's all you have to say? No. I also have 48 hours to get you out of this, so we need to stop talking about your feelings and start talking about the contract. What Daniel did in those 48 hours is a study in what happens when someone who has spent 15 years building a professional network based entirely on integrity calls in every piece of that network at once. He called a commercial contracts lawyer he had worked with for 8 years, a woman named Claire Ashford, who had, in Daniel's experience, never lost a case she understood completely. He sent her the contract at 1 in the morning. She called him back at 3. There is a clause, she said, Section 14, subsection C, the termination conditions. If James can demonstrate material misrepresentation in the original offer, specifically regarding the source of the contract allocation, he can exit within the statutory window. Holt almost certainly knows this clause is in there. He uses it as his own protection. We can use it for James. The statutory window was closing in 31 hours. Daniel then called a contact he had cultivated carefully for 6 years, a man named Graham, who worked in the government department overseeing infrastructure procurement, and who owed Daniel a favor that had never been named or claimed. Daniel named it now. He asked for one piece of information, documentary confirmation of how the contract allocation had been steered and by whom. Graham was silent for a long time. You know what you are asking me. I know exactly what I am asking, and I would not ask if the alternative were not worse. The document arrived by email at 7 in the morning. Claire filed the notice of contract termination at 10, citing material misrepresentation under Section 14, subsection C, with documentary evidence attached. Richard Holt called James at 11. James did not answer. Daniel, sitting across the desk, nodded. James let it ring. By noon, the contract was dissolved. By 3 in the afternoon, Holt's lawyers had sent a letter threatening civil action. Claire sent a response that was 4 pages long and so comprehensively documented that Holt's lawyers did not reply for 6 days. When they did, they advised their client to accept the termination and move on. He did. James sat in his office that evening, the city going dark outside his window, and said nothing for a very long time. A week later they met for dinner, not in an office, at a small restaurant in the city that had been there for 20 years and still had a waiter who knew Daniel's order before he sat down. They ate. They talked about ordinary things, James's daughter's school play, a new road project James was bidding for legitimately, the supply chain contract Daniel had signed that morning that would take his employee count past 800. And then James said what he had been carrying since that midnight conversation. I need to say something. You don't, Daniel said. I do. Let me say it. Daniel put down his fork. I have been thinking about why I didn't call you, and the honest answer is not what I said that night. The honest answer is this. I was afraid that if I called you and you talked me out of it, I would resent you for it. I was afraid the promise would become a cage, that you would become not a friend, but a conscience I was trapped by. The restaurant carried on around them. Quiet conversations at nearby tables. The soft sound of cutlery. "And now?" Daniel said. James looked at his oldest friend, the boy from the rain, the one who had emptied a savings group account, given up a scholarship, called in a government favor, hired a lawyer at 1 in the morning, and asked for nothing in return except that James let it ring. "Now I understand what the promise was. It was never about dragging each other to our dreams. It was about making sure neither of us got there as someone we were ashamed of." Daniel picked up his fork. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a better version of the promise than the one we made." "Yes," James agreed. "We were 9. We didn't know everything yet." "We still don't," Daniel said. "No," James said, and he smiled. The full, unguarded smile of a man who has passed through something difficult and come out the other side still himself, still whole, still in possession of the things that actually matter. "But we know each other, and that's enough." 3 years after that dinner, Daniel Reeves's company employed 1,047 people. He made no announcement when the number passed 1,000. He sent one message to James, who was on a construction site overseeing the early stages of a pedestrian bridge that would connect two communities separated by a river crossing that had been impassable in winter for decades. 1003, just now. The promise is complete. James read the message standing on muddy ground, with the sound of machinery behind him, and pale morning light doing what it always does, arriving slowly, flooding everything gradually, making the world visible again. He looked at his phone for a long moment. He looked at the bridge being built in front of him. He typed back. "Not complete. Expanded. J." And then he put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. The promise two boys made in the rain did not save them from difficulty. It did not protect them from failure, from temptation, from the particular exhaustion of trying to build something real in a world that does not always reward that. What it did was simpler and more durable than any of that. It gave them each a witness, someone who had seen where they started, someone who knew what the dream had looked like before it had any evidence to support it, someone who could say, in the moments when the distance between the dream and the reality felt unbridgeable, "I remember when you had nothing and you still believed, so don't stop now." That is what a real promise is. Not a contract, not a transaction, not a cage. A witness. Someone who sees you fully and shows up anyway. Daniel and James are in their mid-40s now. The company continues to grow. The bridge is open. James's engineering firm has projects in 4 countries. They still talk every week, not always for long, sometimes for 30 seconds, sometimes for 3 hours. The conversations are not always about dreams or promises or the weight of what they have built. Sometimes they are about football, sometimes about their children, sometimes about absolutely nothing at all. But underneath every conversation, unspoken, still alive after more than 30 years, is the memory of 2 boys under a hardware store awning while the rain came down. And the handshake that changed everything.